Okay, so as we dive into the New Testament, one of the things we have to do before we can get into the text of the New Testament is understand the world of the New Testament. A lot of times when we look back at the Old Testament, it's actually pretty easy for us. It begins at the beginning. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So it gives us its own context. However, the New Testament comes after the entirety of the Old Testament and after a period in the middle. And in this period of time, the world between the Old Testament and the New Testament has changed drastically. Empires have risen and fallen. Things have changed. The geopolitical situation is different. And so what we need to do is we need to understand here's the world in which this takes place. So let's just say the last book of the Old Testament is the book of Malachi. All right? The Old Testament ends with Malachi. It's written after the return from exile and after the rebuilding of the temple. So it's dated somewhere between 440 and 430 BC. We aren't exactly sure. We know it's somewhere around in there. So between the closing of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament, we have what we call this the intertestamental period. Intertestamental period. It is roughly a 400-year period between the close of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. And in Protestant circles, we typically refer to this as to 400 years of silence. Now, in Catholic and Orthodox tradition, they kind of pull out and continue the history with the Maccabees, etc., deuterocanonical books, things like that. We're not going to deal with that in that context, but what we understand in terms of inspired Scripture, we have a break between Malachi and then the first events of the New Testament. So what's happened here? Well, in the time frame, we've had the Babylonian Empire, which was it comes out on 539. Then we get to the Persian Empire. This is the Persian Empire, Cyrus the Great, who will bring back the captives there. This Persian Empire, Cyrus rules from a long time there, but during this time, the exiles rebuild the temple, and the empire is in decline. The Persian Empire is in decline by 480 BC. So this empire that has let the exiles come back from there is now in decline. So the question is, what's going to take its place? This nature abhors a vacuum. What's going to happen? Well, after the assassination of Darius III, we find in 330, Alexander the Great conquers Persia. So now we have a new empire coming up with Alexander by 330. In the Middle East is under Alexander by 332, 331 BC there. And under this time, Alexander begins a regime of what's known as Hellenization. Hellenization. It's this bringing Greek culture and Greek language front and center to the empire. Greek, in fact, in this period becomes the lingua franca. It becomes the legal language. It becomes the one of trade, commerce, and law. So this is a huge time, a hugely important time in terms of the way things are shaping up throughout this empire. However, Alexander dies in 323 BC, and he leaves his empire to his generals. And the empire gets divided up into 4 parts. No test over that there, but for our purposes, there are 2 main dynasties that come out of this time. We have the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. The Ptolemies would be situated south in Alexandria, as their capital. So if you think of, you're going to have to excuse my drawing, but if you think of the Mediterranean here, rough drawing, here's Israel. We have here's Israel. And over here is North Africa. Specifically, here's Africa. And here's Egypt. So they're going to be based there in Alexandria. So the Ptolemies will reign for a good while. And the last Ptolemy who's going to have any influence whatsoever is going to be Cleopatra. She dies in 30 BC. However, for us, the Seleucids are going to have power up here in the north, up in Syria. And Antioch is going to be their capital. Now, one of the things we find is there's a struggle between these two throughout these. So the Ptolemies, around south here, are going to rule Palestine from about 320 to 198. Okay, so their center of power, this whole area is going to be kind of ruled by the Seleucids from 320 to 198. During this time, we get what's known as the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of the Old Testament. Now, the tradition is that Ptolemy II, or Philadelphus, in 285 to 246, requested that this be translated so that they would have the scriptures in Greek. Now, how much of this was actually completed during this time is a bit of a question, because we can certainly see differences in the manuscripts, etc. But one of the things we see is that this empire has influence enough that, well, hey, look, we actually have a good time, a good picture of what's going on here, and we're seeing this blossoming of and spreading of the Old Testament in some ways, and making it available in Greek, because a lot of these people too, fewer and fewer people are speaking that native Hebrew tongue. Now, the Ptolemies are defeated in 198. Antiochus III, who's a Seleucid, comes and defeats them in Egypt here. So he defeats them. They're not completely wiped off, but they lose power over Israel and over Palestine there. And from about 198 to 167, it's a little bit of the Seleucids and the Israelites, they have a really, really tense relationship. During this time, you get Antiochus Epiphanes starting about 175. He tried to make Jerusalem more Greek. That does not go over well for him. He replaced the high priest Onias with his brother Jason. Then replaced him with his brother Menelaus. So, trying to bring the Jews in control and in line by taking over their religious center. So that doesn't go over well. He becomes quite hostile, and in 168 he sends Apollonius to collect taxes, and he just absolutely plunders Jerusalem. Basically outlaws Judaism. It is a terrible time under the Seleucids for the Jews. Which brings us to 167 BC, and what's known as the Maccabean Revolt. What happens here, excuse me, is that in 167, the high priest Mattathias is ordered to offer pagan sacrifices. He refuses, and that doesn't go well. But he kills the one who's demanding the sacrifices, and he flees with his 5 sons. Central to them is Judas Maccabeus here, who goes about and over the course of time, he defeats the Seleucids there, drives them out. So we have a big kind of Jewish independence movement underneath what's going to become known as the Hasmonean dynasty. Now, Judas Maccabeus doesn't make it long. He's killed about 160 BC there. But the Hasmonean dynasty is this period of Jewish self-rule is going to go from about 164 to 63, 64 there. what happens is through, though there's this push for Jewish independence, there's still a struggle between Hellenistic and more traditional Judaistic flavors here. Now, through political maneuvering, Judah's brothers worked to secure independence for Palestine there, that you're able to do it. But again, one of the things is that there starts to be fracturing because within the Hasmoneans, we see their political aims, they're achieving those, but often at the expense of their religious aims. So it becomes a very tense time in Palestine here under the Hasmonean dynasty. One of the biggest issues is that Jonathan, Judas's brother, is made high priest. You think, well, that's not a big deal, okay. Well, the problem is the religious opposition grew because the Hasmoneans were not descendants of Zadok the priest. This is going back to the Old Testament here. And so we'll talk about how this sort of plays out, but two groups that we'll see that kind of splinter off at this point are going to be the Pharisees and the Essenes, who are very much opposed to the Hasmoneans at this point. This is something that you're acting no longer acting like Jews. You're acting more and more like Hellenists, and so they don't want to do that. And so one of the things that we see, this tension continues to build in this rough century, 164 to 63 BC, and it kind of builds, and it kind of culminates here with a civil war between Aristobulus II and Hyrcanus II. Brothers go to civil war. That's always a great place to go. And so it weakens Palestine to the point such that in AD 63 BC, the Roman general Pompey is able to march in, and he's put the whole of Palestine under Roman rule. Now, one of the things that he does is, because the Romans tend to be pretty pragmatic about a lot of things, he allows a lot of the natives to rule. All right, they understand. Hey, they're not always going to be able to, when you come in and conquer, you're not always the handsome guy that everybody loves and everybody's cheering on the way in. They've conquered this area, but they know now they have to keep it. And one of the things that happens is, well, in that kind of place, there are, let's just call them people who like to take advantage of the situation. They make the most of it. And one guy who does it better than anybody is a man by the name of Antipater. Antipater is able to gain favor with the Romans, and he moves to get his son placed in authority. And his son, you've heard this name before, his son by the name of Herod. Now, Herod becomes ruler. The Roman Senate consents to it, and Herod is given a kingship, but in a lot of ways he had to take it by arms. Now, it was a difficult time here. One of the problems with Herod is that Herod is what's known as an Idumean. An Idumean here. That means he was a descendant of Esau. He's an Edomite. Jews don't like being ruled by Edomites. It is not a good thing. So it's always going to have this tension. No matter what happens with Herod, there's a tension here between the Jews and Herod. But anyway, here's one of the things we got. And this is where I want us to clear up a little bit as we dive into New Testament history here to help us understand what's going on. So this Herod is known as Herod the Great. And he rules from 37 BC to 4 BC. Under this time, his key project is a beautification and expansion of the Temple Mount. So Herod the Great has a massive role. He has a massive role in terms of Jewish history there, even though he's not always popular. Now, the difficulty that we have is the name Herod shows up throughout, all the way up and through Acts. And it's a bit of a problem because we're actually talking about different people. So let's clear this up a little bit. Herod has 3 sons. He has Archelaus. He has Herod Philip. And he has Herod Antipas. Okay, he has 3 sons. After his death, his sons divide his kingdom. Archelaus gets Judea, Samaria, and Idumea. Philip gets Iturea, Trachonitis, Gaulonitis, some other places there. And Antipas gets Galilee and Perea. Now, Herod Antipas, so here's the next Herod Antipas. He's the next one we often see referred to in terms of the New Testament here. He is the one who gets rebuked by John the Baptist for having his brother Philip's wife. He's the one who will have John the Baptist executed. In fact, in Luke 23, Jesus will be on trial before Herod Antipas. But we're not done with the Herods because we have next Herod Agrippa. Herod Agrippa the First. Herod Agrippa the First is the one who will execute James, the son of Zebedee, in Acts chapter 12. And he will be the one who imprisons Peter. So this is Herod the Great is going to be the one who goes there. He kills, has all the children killed there around the birth of Jesus. Antipas is the one who condemns John the Baptist, and Jesus is on trial before him. Herod Agrippa I is the one who in the first part of Acts there. And if there's one, we also know that there's Herod Agrippa II. Herod Agrippa number 2. He's the one who's going to hear Paul's defense in Acts chapter 25 and 26. So, again, the name Herod, the New Testament, when we talk about this is just coming out of history here. It all starts with General Pompey taking over, putting this under Roman rule. Herod the Great becomes the first Herod. He takes control there, and he is able to subjugate the area and do some Temple Mount expansions. But from him, we're going to get Herod Antipas, has his brother Philip's wife, Herod Agrippa I, and Herod Agrippa II. So all of these things are actually parts of history. They're not just part of the text, they're actually part of the history. Here's how these things came about. So as we kind of put this history in there's a lot of other things we're going to do. Next, we're going to look at religion in the first century here and what's going on. But just sort of want to get this historical framework so that we can now take that next